Hey, Sharon here. I am going to be talking about existential responsibility on therapeutic outcome as the main topic in the presentation. And this is in context of counseling. And um, existential responsibility draws from almost like into the concept of self-responsibility that I'll be using interchangeably throughout the presentation. And um, I'm it, it's a concept that I'm borrowing to um, as a attitude of existential therapy, um, a discussion point that I myself have personally applied in counseling with my clients, usually in the mid to ending session of counseling. And I incorporate more of an existential framework, especially around talking about clients and what their self responsibility is. Um, and it's not a new or a novel kind of idea, but it essentially helps enhance their ability to want to be independent past therapy. And with the spin on existentialism as a life attitude on wholly being a human is to be fully responsible for facing your existential givens, and we'll later talk a little bit about that, um, is not unique to counseling. So, yeah, we'll start. Actually, before that, do want to mention that um, existentialism, and specifically in context of counseling, so existential therapy or ET for short, isn't a popular kind of approach as a standalone in North America. I think it has a lot to do with its techniques, or if I have to say, it doesn't necessarily fall into techniques. It's more of attitudes or discussion points or frame of mind we guide our clients along, which, depending on the presenting concern, I'd say it's part of long term therapy. And a lot of the push in counseling, especially counseling in North America, where there's more emphasis of short term targeted therapy, they're shorter term. So I see that existential therapy doesn't really fit well with that, and it's not. I don't believe it's recognized, um, picked up on um, as a standalone therapy, that perhaps even insurance companies would kind of see as a legit therapy for coverage. Um, so those are my thoughts on the lack of popularity for it, but nonetheless, I meet myself and other therapists have used existential framework to add in as an add-in on top of, say, other approaches like evidence-based approaches like CBT, narrative therapy, solution-based focus therapy, um, in an integrative way. Okay, so some of the learning objectives for to start and throughout presentation, we'll start with existential influencers. And what I mean by influencers, uh, I mean people that are scholars historically across time, across disciplinaries. They could be philosophers, psychologists, historians, theologians, and across kind of different aspects of literary works on subjects like spirituality and religion, and even like fiction. So I'll touch on that just to give it some justice because of existentialists' uh, deep history, past history, that which draws back into a lot of European thinkers. Um, and I think it's important baseline to understand that despite these various voices, which I'll take out snippets of quotes from their works, that there is a common theme of existential or self responsibility as part of kind of the human condition. And I borrow this to apply into therapy, which isn't something new, but just to explain why I'm going into depth with these influencers that aren't quite psychologists or speaking to directly to psychology field. So we'll look into the existential lens on the human condition. What does the literature say about existential self-responsibility? So use those interchangeably. And specifically in context of how to get from unhealthy, I'm assuming that the client comes into therapy as with an unhealthy existential frame of mind, to help them bring along towards the path of health. So it's not quite it's a range. And arguably there has been um, some researches that I will post, I will go through, that does suggest that it has some capacity, the healthiness has some capacity with um, the degree of self responsibility one takes. And so, existential responsibility constructs that we'll touch on in almost a roundabout way, that insofar as to kind of measure this self responsibility existential concept, we'll look into freedom, relatedness, meaning as kind of frames of reference. And what I mean by measure is almost like if we are to evaluate any other empirically based therapies like CBT, there is a measure that we can a measure in terms of like symptoms, or for instance, if there's a particular behavior that we're trying to um, work on replacing that's maladaptive, it's a matter of degree. You know, throughout therapy, perhaps with CBT strategies and replacement strategies, perhaps that particular behavior reduces or ameliorates in replace for another healthier behavior. So that's a little bit more measurable. But as we're talking about self responsibility, it could just because of the meaning behind it, there's no one standalone definition across literatures. I did find one that I'm going to be using today. That there's another, the only other way that I'm thinking of measuring is through clients' spontaneous talking points about freedom, relatedness, and meaning as indicators of self responsibility. So acquiring essential self-responsibility. So embedded in there is, you know, we could guide our clients along acquiring self-responsibility throughout their treatment course. And that might mean that could help maintain maintain their skills and tools learned in therapy to minimize relapse. And all this ties into, in context of counseling, existential therapy, so ET. We'll look at the therapeutic outcomes and also limitations. And I hope that throughout this presentation, I I'm not as I'm not leaning towards a bias, you know, favoritism for existential therapy, as it is I do have a like orientation towards it. Not necessarily disregarding the utilities of others, but I tend to kind of pick up on that perhaps because of my beliefs and my biases. So I hope to call myself out and be critical about ET with some limitations because there are. And then I'll talk a little bit about what's next for ET and counseling. Not a lot of movement there, but some of my thoughts on it, and then some of the kind of overarching societal views I see how ET could be helpful for. Okay, so I'll go through, I think, 4 or 5 thinkers, and like I mentioned, they range from like philosophers, psychologists, psychiatrists, like novelists, that shares a voice in helping establish the fundamentals of existentialism to which ET draws from. And so, Sir, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. So, Søren Kierkegaard, he is considered the father of existentialism, who, along with Friedrich Nietzsche, um, Nietzsche is a German philosopher. I'll touch him very, very minor. And they both founded the fundamentals of existentialism. Um, so Kierkegaard, just he is kind of like a almost like a jack of all trades kind of thinker. His writings range from philosophy, religion, theology, psychology, that kind of tie together his worldview. And it's important to note that during that time that he existed, or his ideas are drawn from his environment, where Christianity was kind of the main religion in picking up during that time. So he did have a critical view against religious ideologies, in a sense that, um, like in ideologies, in a sense of perhaps identifying as kind of groups, and it, I'm, and it seems to peel away from personal agency. So what his stance is, if you're going to believe in God, to just have a direct relationship with him, be instead of kind of um, um, uh, being grouped into these followings. Um, I think I did okay with that interpretation. So ultimately he did focus on the limits of human experience, the internal focus, to contrast this kind of what's called I would call maybe a herd mentality um, of that time, with one not having their own as much subjective opinions, and kind of being away in the way of potentiating one's authenticity. And I'll mention the word potentiate a lot of times throughout this presentation. It's really looking at one's capacity and potential. And in this regard, his potential for being authentic is his path that he thinks that as part of some existential experience that humans go through. And in this quote, he reads here, life can only be understood looking back, but it must be lived by looking forward. And how I see this ties into what we're talking about is, especially in counseling, we often, clients come in with, their past stories and their upbringings, which are important insofar as, and I would agree with Kierkegaard here, that it plots kind of the steps on how to move forward. And the emphasis in terms of bettering oneself um, is to look into the current and in the future. Um, and that's where the self-responsibility in it lies as well. And his other quote, all shrewdness of man seeks one thing, to be able to live without responsibility. And I see it as a kind of like uh, table turning way to talk about how it's tempting to not live without responsibility. But ultimately, what he's really suggesting is the necessity to live with responsibility. And then we have Dostoevsky. He is uh, a Russian novelist, and he's written a lot of perhaps classical critiques um, on almost calling out the ideologies of the time, perhaps the utopian ideologies, later known as communism, and kind of the extremes of society during that time. And he kind of plays it off through these fictions and these characters through stories, that houses some truths and qualities of, and he does lay some foundations of existential, where existential fundamentals are drawn from. And he masterfully does this. And here I draw a quote that captures that. There is only one way to salvation, and that is to make yourself responsible for all men's sins. Soon as you make yourself responsible in all sincerity for everything and for everyone, you will see at once that this is really so, and that you are in fact to blame for everyone and for all things. And this is it's his extreme way of saying, from what my interpretations are, is that to take responsibility at its extremes is to not to extremes could consider faulty if you're going to be if you're going to take the responsibility for everything and all things outside of you. It calls to kind of perhaps not being or taking responsibility expediently, willy-nilly, without considering it more seriously. And that's from the brothers Karamazov. And his other literary work, next quote here, I'll go, "This minute, of course, I remained." So here is kind of like a funny, like a satire-ish way also to poke fun at kind of the extremes of, okay, I will bow down to this order, the external of me, but then I don't do that. So it's from Notes from Underground. So as you can tell, he kind of explores these extremes of collective responsibility, kind of in Brothers Karamazov, and inner mechanism, and that it kind of nonetheless mobilizes our inner mechanisms of guilt. And the second quote kind of explores one's means to create our own sense. And we'll talk about a sense later on as a concept, a bit delineated from the existential concept. So creating their own sense and their path instead of an external authoritarian ideology. Okay, I will start shortening my these quotes, not to take away from the importance of these thinkers. Viktor Frankl, Austrian psychiatrist, who was imprisoned in the Holocaust prison camps and survived. And he went into it as with psychiatry background. He was a psychiatrist, and that helped kind of shape the way he thought even throughout the course of his survival, right? There's many times he felt like he was on the brink of gonna die, and he was facing all these existential crises of death and torment and loss of loved ones and his wife. But he nonetheless survived, and through his learnings and his experience as a psychiatrist there almost seems like he self-experimented with himself, and he had the lens of kind of analyzing the world that way, in parallel with being a prisoner, witnessing all this, all these horrible, inhumane, trauma-inducing situations. So, nonetheless, he devoted the rest. After he survived, he devoted the rest of his life to continue his learning, and he pretty much kind of brings that meaning-seeking through suffering can potentiate therapeutic change. And that was a view established in local therapy, which is what he developed thereafter. And his ideas were really helpful in social welfare and had counseling implications. And ultimately, his research found a lot of relationships between lacking meaning and maladaptive behaviors like addictions, mental health conditions like depression, and ultimately tying back to adopting responsibility through seeking one's own meaning. And I'll just read this statement here that I'm taken from his works. It really does not matter what we expected from life, but rather what life expected of us. We needed to stop asking about the meaning of life and instead to think about ourselves as those who are being questioned by life daily and hourly. Life ultimately means taking the responsibility to find the right answers to its problems and fulfill the tasks which it constantly sets for each individual. So here there's more of accountability that pegs the individual to be accountable to live through being responsible to finding out the answers to deal with your problems, um, and it's also through meaning seeking as part of the task, and it also like changes frequently, so it's never kind of, it'll keep you on your feet, which is kind of the last part, which constantly sets for each individual. So kind of instilled in it that cycles of life, we go through a lot of different kind of tragedies. Just because we gone through one suffering, there's other sufferings as we move through the course of life. Losing your job at one time, losing financials, losing a loved one, and then facing your own death. Right? It constantly sets a new challenge for us. So might as well take responsibility on how we make of it. Okay, and Rollo May is an American psychiatrist, and he was quite influential in bringing existentialism into psychotherapy into the States. And he founded humanistic psychology with Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. And again, through a quote here, we see, well, I'll read from here. Does not the possibility or the power to do something about the situation at hand confer one the responsibility to do so? So if we see we have the power to change something, doesn't it say that in itself that we're responsible to change that thing? And again, he also adds to the previous dialogue, the voices of others, that responsibility within oneself is through seeking authenticity and through growth. And then Irvin Yalom, also a American psychiatrist, existential psychiatrist, and he was a bit influenced by Nietzsche. And so I will read his quotes directly. Change occurs when one becomes what he is not when he tries to become what he is not. And so again, kind of like, don't try to be what you're not, because that's not towards the path of authenticity and holding the responsibilities to be who you are. And the next quote one must confront one's ultimate aloneness and insignificance. There is no choice but to do so. So he tags on one of the givens of the four givens I'll touch on in a bit on isolation. So it's part of a kind of human condition we all kind of go through, Yalom states. And having to go through it is part of there's no choice, he states. It's our self-responsibility. So he describes ultimately so isolation, along with three other existential givens, which are meaninglessness and freedom and death. And almost like a template that we all go through as humans. And this idea predates Guillaume. I'd say that I hear this in what Martin Heidegger, he's also a German philosopher, and his ideas on essentialism, like I earlier mentioned, I'll go through in more detail now. And essentially, Heidegger found that essentialism is contrary against the traditional belief of existentialism, which claims that human existence happens before a sense. So that's the existential claim. So we exist, and then we kind of live out our lives. Instead, Heidegger, and kind of from what Guillaume's quoting here with his Four Givens, is that our essence, kind of like even a template or kind of ideas of what makes humans, or a blueprint, kind of happens even before we're born, for it to be so widespread for everyone to have to go through. So in a sense, it happens before we're alive, before being. Um, and in that, we kind of, I'll carry on that we have this the self-responsibility piece in living out these blueprint items and humanist experiences. I'd say it doesn't seem like, I don't know if it's a play on free will. Like, do we have the free will? Is self-responsibility inbuilt in us? And it also calls to, we do have a capacity for self-responsibility then. And avoiding that is kind of like avoiding being human and what we're supposed to be doing, or be supposed to be as humans. Okay, so hopefully I did that justice. Again, overall, like various different thinkers influencing the ideas of the fundamentals behind existential therapy, that points to kind of themes about one's responsibility to living is, towards the path of meaning, the path of being ourselves, the path of moving forward. House in taking responsibility. So, looking at the existential lens, altogether foregrounding existential therapy, ET, is the presumption that individuals are motivated by their urge to fulfill their existence, and can pursue this by seeking meaning and taking responsibility to actualize their potential. So how one seeks responsibility tends to differ from one another, depending on their life experience. I may experience a loss of a loved one perhaps more difficult than someone else with the same situation, maybe due to our resilience factors from historical upbringing. And it also differs based on our existential skills. So, do we have a resilience or kind of a mindset of accepting these life shortcomings, or do we tend to falter and, question why me? And, it prevents us from embracing what we need to do to kind of move forward. And Van Durezen is another existential therapist, and she extends that humans naturally are oriented in seeking meaning that's manifested in suffering. So, kind of a continuation of Frankl's voice here. So further, humans' predispositions to seek meaning depends on their capacity to hold ownership for accompanying freedoms and choices. And as such, we would function most optimally when responsibility is taken to embrace them and not run from them. So these assumptions imply that being human entails enduring struggles, such as being diagnosed with a terminal illness or kind of dealing with a serious clinical illness that's lifelong, that ultimately changes your day to day. But ultimately, nonetheless, it is not a unique prerequisite for holding this existential orientation to seek responsibility. As such, clients seek counseling experiences with all kinds of psychological problems, such as even if it's diagnosed or not, and and still experience a level of existential striving, of um, of having a potential to make meaning on how they move forward. So this presentation examines how solving one's existential problem through the constructs of self-responsibility taking helps sustain therapeutic outcomes. How does it strengthen um, one's um, therapy past when therapy ends to avoid relapse? How does one who suffered from addiction for 20 plus years learn CBT strategies in 10 short sessions? And if we add existentialism thoughts about discussions to enhance their meaning behind even why they're doing this and how they're going to move forward and applying these strategies to get better and not relapse. How does that help them not relapse? So this is where existential's utility could be seen as an add-on for these shorter term structured therapy that are less focused on humanistic. So and so So, self responsibility is also inextricably linked to other constructs like freedom, relatedness, and meaning that we'll go into deeper detail in a bit. And they will be discussed in as much to supplement a more extensive understanding of self responsibility. But nonetheless, they are broad constructs. So, I'll do my best to kind of shorten and concise it so um, it just adds kind of a justification element to self-responsibility. Now, what does the literature say about self-responsibility and how does existential therapy come into play? So self-responsibility has been explored across different psychological orientations at various capacities, empirically, cognitively, and without a universal definition. Um, Researchers have tried to attempt to measure this concept. So Gomez, Levin, and Prince attempted to explore mechanisms behind self-responsibility by empirically examining whether moral continuity, um, so if we did something that's morally impacts us, like maybe it's morally wrong, how does this continue to impact us through time and through our lives? So he used this as a kind of a lens to look at self-responsibility, or vehicle to look at self-responsibility. And he hypothesized that as a sub-construct of responsibility, it influences one's level of responsibility for past behavioral conduct. So specifically, they had found that perceived changes in one's moral enhancements. So seeing that despite someone engaged in violence in the past, they improved. So that's a moral enhancement. They were indeed found to reduce responsibility for past actions. So others would view that if this person saw that they got better, others evaluate them as being less responsible for that action. As funny as that sounds, though the past action already happened. So because there's a lot of people that have observed this, their argument was that it's innate in ourselves to see in others, and as a looking glass into ourselves, that improving our morals, um, and that's a construct of self-responsibility, does does indicate some changes from within that are an existential kind of responsibility taking. And so, yeah, so this is just kind of like a forensic example that explores how one self-responsibility, internal moral change is more forgivable, which is synonymous to true change, versus behavioral change, which kind of like surface, time served. Um, so it taps into a deeper um, non-enforceable change within. So we can go back to what Dostoevsky um, kind of played on, not agreeing, someone serving a sentence based on what external factors had imposed, like being, you know, a mandate, like being ordered to live in prison. That's not synonymous to the kind of change we're talking about here, that is deep moral change, that, if these external measures aren't there, how are we going to improve our morals and take responsibility for our actions? And that's what kind of what Gomez and I believe Dostoevsky, if he was alive, would kind of agree on together. Um, so to belabor the point, Gomez, Levine, and Prince would hypothesize that if moral values are crucial to one's self-identity over time, then perceived changes in their set of values may reduce responsibility for past deeds. Um, so yeah, just in summary, it's a moral roundabout way to attempt to measure self-responsibility through measuring its aspects, so moral continuity. I did want to spend a little bit more time on here just because um, it's again it's difficult to measure self-responsibility. So to be able to kind of reiterate kind of um, the points that are a bit more abstract might help us better understand. Um, and then similarly, Shahar and Ziv Bayman, they used cognitive existential psychodynamics. So in short, CEP perspectives to observe renormalization tendencies. And this is specifically through, uh, giving patients more control in a therapy session. So it's not the therapist kind of the external dictator of the therapy, right? The client themselves having their own agency to determine when treatment ends. So this is an attempt to kind of mobilize self-responsibility. And this had been found to enhance clients' engagement in therapeutic experiences. And they even found, and I kind of find this kind of cool to apply to my clients that are mandated, or didn't really, maybe a spouse brought them into therapy. So I would call them maybe more treatment resistance. And they responded well to CEP. And they believed that this is through taking responsibility to feel like they have something worth doing, and not just externally agreeing. They have something internal desire to be responsible, to be better in this therapy. So overall, ET's integration is most compatible with other approaches, like I mentioned, cognitive therapies, that also emphasizes internal processes such as thoughts about autonomy. And with CBT, they do have tend to have inbuilt homework. I think regardless of what therapy modality I use, I always assign homework. And I think that a good measure of my own measure doesn't mean it's accurate. A measure of one taking self-responsibility is, them doing homework, right? And if I notice a client's not doing their homework, perhaps talking about existential responsibility could enhance their adherence to doing so. Is this homework, like, what are your barriers to doing this homework, right? And not in um, a uh, a negative reinforcing way, but also turning it around and creatively um, kind of helping them see that doing their homework is them having responsibility to improve themselves. So that's kind of how I kind of play off merging existential responsibility with other modalities.